Welcome to Built to Finish. I'm your host, Stephen Pivnik. Join me each week as we explore the journeys of audacious goal setters. This includes experienced founders, CEOs, and entrepreneurs sharing pivotal moments that propel their success. We'll also be talking with endurance athletes who push the limits of physical and mental ability. This show is brought to you by Acresis, offering tailored, high-impact advisory services to help founders get to their finish line with a strategic acquisition or majority investor recapitalization. Let's get started. I can't wait to introduce today's guest. He is a seasoned pilot with a remarkable career that spans over 3 decades, both in military and in commercial aviation. He began his aviation career in the US Air Force, where he trained as a pilot at Williams Air Force Base and later became an instructor at Mather Air Force Base. His time in the US Air Force saw him flying the T-37, T-38 aircraft and working with NATO pilots. Following his military service, he transitioned to FedEx, where he flew the Boeing 727, Airbus 300, and the Boeing 767, retiring in 2022 after an illustrious career. Mark Peters, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate your invitation.
Oh, it's a pleasure and an honor. So first off, I want to thank you for your service. As an immigrant that loves this country, I'm super thankful to everyone that serves and that has served. So thank you for that. Second, thank you for your service at FedEx because I'm sure you have flown many of my packages over the years. And I'm sure everyone listening or watching is super thankful for both of these things as well.
Yeah, well, I do my job and I try and get the packages there absolutely, positively.
I love that. I love that. So I've got a ton of questions for you. I'm going to go just back and forth between your FedEx career and your military career, if you don't mind. So please share, like, what is the day in the life of a FedEx pilot like?
A typical, it kind of changed throughout my career. I was there for 28 years. So obviously business has changed over that time. When I first was hired, it was almost exclusively night flying. So I'll give you that snapshot. We would show up somewhere between 9 and 11 p.m. at the airport. We'd usually be coming from a layover hotel in an outlying city. FedEx uses what they call a hub and spoke. So they want the airplanes and the crews in these outlying cities. They'll fly them into these main hubs, resort the packages, reload the airplanes, and they depart to those outlying cities again. So again, we'd show up late evening. We would fly the airplanes. The biggest hub for FedEx was Memphis, so that was a common destination. And then when we transitioned to the hub after we landed, we would usually have anywhere between an hour to maybe a 3-hour wait while that sorting process was completed. And then we would climb back in the airplanes and usually depart and go back to the city we came from. So they would try and keep it sort of city pairs, as they'd call it. So, maybe it was Oklahoma City to Memphis. Maybe it was Oakland to Memphis. Maybe it was Newark to Memphis. And so you'd probably typically fly that same trip every week. Weather was always a factor. The South has lots of thunderstorms and so it was always unique every night. But one of the coolest things about that experience, speaking of a day in a life, there might even be a YouTube on this, is they show the arrival pattern into Memphis. And on a clear night, you can see this string of headlights out hundreds of miles as those FedEx,
All the planes lined up.
all the FedEx jets lining up at close proximity, like most major airports. And we'd come in very choreographed, and it was probably a good thing that all of us FedEx pilots had a pretty good idea of how it was going to happen. And then once we departed Memphis and headed back out to our outlying cities, we'd be landing early AM, 3, 4, 5 AM in those outlying cities, and then back to the hotel. And sort of like a vampire bat, we'd go to sleep during the day. You do the best you can. Some people anticipated that a little bit better than others.
Right.
I was always fortunate. I could sleep through the day. and do it all over again. So the schedule was typical. You'd do that for a week, you'd get the next week off, and then you'd be back into it the following week.
Rinse, repeat, right?
Exactly.
So switching gears to your military career, can you share one of the most memorable or challenging missions that you flew in the military?
I'll start with the most memorable, and I think it goes back a while. It was when I was an instructor pilot in Sacramento at Mather Air Force Base. And so we were flying a small two-seat trainer, the T-37, and we got an opportunity because we were pretty much the only training base on the West Coast. We got invited to do a lot of these special flights. We would do four-ship flybys for Memorial Day, for 4th of July. Sometimes right there at the Air Force Base, and sometimes at outlying locations, they'd have us come fly. And I was really fortunate during my time there to be able to lead a four-ship flyby to my hometown. They have a big pro rodeo there. They requested that we do a flyby. Happens to be on the 4th of July. Very patriotic. So, we take off the four-ship. We get together. We are not the Blue Angels nor the Thunderbirds, but we put on a pretty good show. And so I was able to fly over the rodeo, of course, low altitude. The T-37s are really loud airplanes, so we make a big
Hmm.
noise as we come by. But the coolest piece of that was that not only my own family, but my in-laws were there with my wife and kids.
Oh, nice.
And I didn't know this till later, but my wife looked over at my mother-in-law after we had gone by, and she had tears in her eyes. And I'm
Aw,
thinking, you know, I, I think it's really cool to have an impact like that just by doing simply your job.
amazing. So, what inspired you to transition from flying in the Air Force to becoming a FedEx pilot? And how do you compare? I mean, I know they're radically different experiences, but like, how would you compare them?
It wasn't a snapshot decision, honestly. I obviously joined the Air Force because I found out that I loved flying, and I was there for a number of years. The I won't say the problem. The issue when you fly in the military is, as a young pilot, they fly you a ton. They want you experience, they want you to go do the job. And at some point, as you increase and go up in rank, they want you to actually, become more of a manager, shall we say. So
Hmm.
that usually requires additional schooling, military schooling. Sometimes that's a move back to DC to the Pentagon. The bottom line is it's a job that's out of the cockpit. And that's what I love doing. And I couldn't really comfortably see myself finishing a 20-year career knowing they were going to have these sort of big pauses in my aviation. So as I got to that first initial juncture where they were starting to look at moving me on to a non-flying position, I thought, I had a lot of friends that had gotten out of the Air Force and started flying commercially. And they're saying, don't hesitate, put your applications in, try and get a job. And so that was the transition. So it wasn't that I disliked the Air Force. I just saw greener pastures. And so um, at the at that juncture, I finally was able to say, okay, I'm going to go try and find a flying position with the commercial airlines. At the time, United and FedEx were the only airlines hiring. It's a very cyclical type of hiring process, need for pilots and so forth. And so the the FedEx, I had more friends there. They were able to get my resume in the right spot. So the FedEx job came to me first. I thought, well, bird in the hand. And so off I went to Memphis for initial training. And again, it was one of those things like, well, I'll give this a try. I can fly cargo for a while and then maybe look to go to United, Delta, Southwest, whoever was going to be next. But once I got there, I realized, I didn't mind the schedule. The night flying didn't bother me. The schedule, as far as how it integrated with our home life, was good. So it seemed like it was going to be a good match. And I feel really fortunate to have had that decision. And that was because FedEx, unique to aviation, is that we are not as affected by the economic ups and downs that other airlines do. 9/11, you could say that echoed through the aviation industry for maybe a dozen years. FedEx was down for 3 days while everyone else, while the airspace was closed. And as soon as they opened airspace, it was business as normal. Yeah. So it was a, uh, I never felt, I never looked back and said, God, I wish I really would have stayed in the Air Force.
Cool. So sounds like it was a great decision and
Yeah.
paid off fantastically for you.
Yes. Yeah.
So every time I meet a pilot, I have like a common question, whether at a bar, at a party, anywhere. I always ask the same question. What was the scariest moment up there for you? How did you respond? And what role did your training play into whatever response you needed to implement?
Well, yeah, so I have gotten that question a lot of times. And let me preface this like, I never had a Sully moment. There was never a moment that I was wondering if I was going to have to land in the Hudson. And that was, obviously a once in a lifetime for that guy. But I do remember when I read his book, he said that he had an unremarkable career up to that point. And by
Cool.
that, he meant that he had never had a serious aircraft emergency. He had had
Right.
the little things that we all experience that are honestly kind of inconsequential. Systems fails, but they're backups and so forth.
Hmm.
So to take the wind out of the sails a little bit, I never had that moment. But there was one time to share with you is we were departing. I was flying the Airbus at the time. We were departing out of Oakland, California, and it never is monotonous, but it gets very routine, which in some
Hmm.
ways is good. And so we were departing, we take off, and as you know, shortly after you lift off and get airborne, you raise the gear. And so the captain was flying, I was the co pilot at the time, and we try and lift the gear lever, and it doesn't move. And so
Okay.
that's a problem. And then moments later, um, we get all sorts of bells and horns and warnings. There's a little electronic screen that lists the systems that are broken, and that is quickly filling up with items. And so it's a bit
So
of
you
an
so you never want the cockpit to become a Christmas tree. That's like the last
never.
thing you want to
Yeah,
see.
well said. Yeah, the less lights,
Okay.
the better. And in
Right.
fact, it's interesting you bring that up because Airbus actually builds their cockpit in a lights out configuration. So in other words, when everything's good, there's no lights. There's not like a bunch of green lights to show you that, oh, everything's cool. It's like, nope,
Okay. So no lights means all systems go.
all good. Yes.
Okay.
So anyway, we're shortly airborne, and all of a sudden, it feels like everything's coming apart, and it really wasn't. But it goes back to the first training in aviation that I ever got, and there's this saying in aviation is just take a breath and wind the clock. And so, people are like, well, what does that mean? Well, in most, 20, 30 years ago, there was an analog clock in the cockpit that you would use for timing and so forth. And it was like any other, like an old wristwatch. You had to wind it to keep it keeping time. And what the goal of that wind the clock is don't do anything reactionary. Just reach
Okay.
up, wind the clock, take a breath, back off. What do you've got? And so, again, we're flying, and the captain, to his credit, goes, I think this is a gear warning switch. And it sounds complicated, but obviously there are these little switches in all airplanes that tell you the gear's up or the gear's down. and our gear had not retracted. And so that was why we couldn't lift the gear handle. And in the nose gear of the Airbus, that little switch controls a bunch of different systems.
Okay.
And to put it bluntly, it tells the airplane, am I on the ground or am I airborne?
Hmm.
So now the airplane's airborne, but this little switch is still telling it the airplane that it's on the ground. And so now the computers are just kind of going bonkers, honestly. And they're giving the all these warnings and lights and stuff.
I'm sweating just by listening to this.
And so, you know, and to be blunt, if this were a passenger airplane, you probably would have never known this occurred. But you know, both the captain and I go, you know, I don't think this is a big deal. You know, I think that we've got a switch that's malfunctioning, but let's not change anything. Let's not try and raise the gear. Let's not try and raise the flaps. Let's maintain our airspeed. Let's just go around the pattern. We'll come back around. We were light enough weight wise. We didn't have to go burn fuel and come back in, get the airplane back on the ground, let the mechanics take care of it. And it, so how that dovetails into my training is, you know, never rush, because
Hmm.
when you rush, you're likely going to potentially make the situation worse, which is
Sure.
obviously not good. And we both kind of reverted back to our initial pilot training. You know, do we have gear? Yes. Do we have a flyable airplane? Yes. Are we running out of fuel? No. The weather good? Yes. Let's come around the pattern, put it back on the ground, hand it over to the professionals. So that was just one of many ones that, you know, to an untrained eye, be like, oh boy, this is a big one. And
Right.
as it turns out, it wasn't that big a deal. But it reminds you that, you know, whether you're preparing for an Ironman or to climb a mountain, you know, your preparation and your training is critical, even if it seems kind of mundane or I've done this before.
Yep. Wise words. I couldn't have said it better myself. So speaking of training, like we've all seen Top Gun. Well, I hope we've all seen Top Gun because it's my favorite movie. And we've seen. I'm sure a lot of people have watched a whole bunch of Navy SEAL training movies, where it depicts an incredibly rigorous and arduous training program, which really put folks through the ringer. How realistic is Hollywood depicting what you personally went through?
You know, it's a great question because, you know, obviously, you know, Hollywood tries to make it as exciting as possible.
Of course.
And, you know, I think we get a little glimpse into SEAL training. It's always looks rigorous, which I'm sure it is. Something I don't think I'd want to attempt. But the training that I got, so it kind of depends. During your initial pilot training, you go in certain tracks based on what airplanes you're going to go eventually and fly.
Okay.
And because I was an instructor pilot, I was going to an airplane that had an ejection seat. And so that required some additional training. It's not very glamorous, but they do you know, obviously train you as best they can. They've got this little kind of slingshot apparatus that
Okay.
you sit in, and they say it's not even close to the actual explosion really that gets you out of the airplane.
So
But
the real one is going to be a lot worse, you're
exactly,
saying.
yeah,
Okay.
and it's affected by how fast the airplane's going. You know, your what they call the ejection envelope. You know, are you too low to the ground for the parachute to open and so forth. So there's a lot to go in with that goes into that. But that being said, because you're in an ejection seat, you also do what they call water survival and winter survival. Um, and that winter survival also includes some simulated POW training.
Holy cow.
So the first thing we did once we finished pilot training, they sent us down to an Air Force base that is now closed called Homestead, south of Miami, and we did water survival. And honestly, it was kind of like a vacation. The water's warm. You know, they simulate that you have ejected from your airplane over water, and now you're going to land in the water. So honestly, they take you on this kind of landing craft, and they take you parasailing.
Really?
There's a parachute, and they allow you to float up a couple 100 feet, and then you
Okay.
disconnect, just like you would in Cabo. You go parasailing.
This is a military training. They're taking you parasailing.
Exactly. And so, you float down to the ocean, and you've got your life raft, just like you saw in Top Gun. You've got all that stuff with you, and your life preserver. And your idea is to get into the lifeboat, and then they had a Coast Guard helicopter that would come out, and there were training that you did to hook yourself in. They'd lift you up to the helicopter,
Mhm.
but you didn't get to get in because there were 12 or 15 of us in the class, and the helicopter was small, so we weren't going to all fit. So they bring you up just so you'd
So there's 12 of you being hoisted out of the water, but you can't get into the helicopter.
yeah, they take you up, and the Coast Guard, being as friendly as they are, they had a cookie. Here's your cookie, and then they'd let you back down to the water. So anyway, and then a boat would come by in the water and pick you up. They didn't leave you out there in the Gulf. So we that was water survival, and it was like I said, it wasn't too rigorous.
You came back with a tan?
Well, yeah, absolutely. Tan. We took some days of leave. We went to Disney World. It was great. And on the other end of the spectrum is we also had this what they called land survival. Now, that's done up in Washington State. As far as I know, is still taking place in the same location outside of Spokane. And that is not only how to survive in an injection that would put you in the wilderness, but it also dovetailed into what they were. It was POW training, and this was developed during Vietnam, when the guys that were actually getting shot down didn't have the skills to escape and evade the enemy. So they wanted to train pilots on what to do. And so they have again, it felt very Hollywood, but it was very authentic POW training camp where they would simulate that you were caught, and it was nothing like what the guys went through in Vietnam. There was nothing particular, but the one thing I'll share with that is that it's miserable. I was up there in February. It was cold and it was raining, and you're out in the mud, and you haven't eaten in days, and but the one thing they had us is they simulated that we were in formation in this POW situation, and you felt like, God, are we going to have to be here another day or another 12 hours? We had no idea, and it the coolest piece of that was we were all at attention. There is U.S. Air Force personnel that's simulating the bad guys, and they said, please stand at attention. And they started playing the Star Spangled Banner. And they said to do an about face, which is military for turnaround. And when we turned around, they were raising the Stars and Stripes up the flagpole. And so this was the moment that gave me the most pride that I've ever felt in our nation. I mean, every time from that moment on,
You just gave me chills. I'm sure anybody
what
listening is
I
having
was
chills as
just gonna
well.
say the same, Steve, because every time the Star Spangled Banner plays now, I get chills. Whether it's before the baseball game, sometimes even when it's played on a television, I still
Right.
get that chills because it was such an amazing experience. So that's a long way to come back to your question is, what kind of training and how realistic is the Top Gun scenario? Can't speak to naval aviation, but I think that particular movie maybe does the best job because simulating flying, and especially aggressive high performance flying on a movie
Mhm.
screen, is really, really tough. When you look
I'm
at it through
sure.
a pilot's eyes, it's really tough to get it right. And
Right.
that I think anyone truly could probably look at some of these, simulated, CGI airplane shots, and you're going, yeah,
Uh-huh.
that's not real.
Right.
So yeah.
Awesome. Wow. I'm just still blown away by everything that you had to go through. And
Mm.
from a an adventure and thrill seeker perspective,
Mhm.
which I am, is like, is there a course? Can I sign up to go do that for a week just to get that experience?
You know,
But
you probably could. I'm not sure that's exactly. You might want to go do like the Bear Grylls type thing, so nobody's yelling at you. He seems like a pretty good guy. Yeah, you're gonna have to eat some, slugs and mussels and stuff, but
yeah.
other than that, you ought to be okay.
I love it. So, speaking of experiences, I mean, you've probably flown all around the world. I assume that you've flown internationally as well.
Mhm.
What what location, stands out as probably the coolest or most memorable destination you've flown to?
You know, I'd say it's probably there are kind of two that rise to the top, but the one that was the most memorable was when I was flying a cargo airplane in the Air Force, and we were taking. It was right after the USSR had disbanded, and as you might remember, the early '90s, a lot of those smaller countries now were in really bad shape.
Right.
They needed medical supplies, they needed basic needs. And so the Air Force, the United States government decided, well, we're going to send in some humanitarian aid. And so I got to do one of those flights into a town called Novosibirsk. If you look on the map, it's north of India. It's way, way, way deep into what we now know as Russia. Um, and we came in from Germany. The airplane was full of very basic needs. I didn't see exactly, but I think it was like penicillin and bandages and hypodermics and real basic stuff. And at the time, the Soviet Union had just broken up, so their neighbors were still kind of cranky. Poland would not give us overflight, so when we left Germany, we had to go north, almost up towards Moscow, and then way back down south, and landed at this. I won't say a town because the city was quite a ways away from the airport that we landed at. But everything went north. In fact, the one thing I forgot to mention was that in Germany, we actually picked up a uh, uh, a Russian navigator. Because we weren't. I don't know if it was us, Air Force, or State Department weren't quite sure of our ability to communicate once we got very deep into Russia with
Okay.
the air traffic
Oh, so you,
controllers.
so you needed a translator in the cockpit.
Yeah, and it was just kind of a safety net, to be honest with you. And so, um, again, we fly this long flight. I couldn't even tell you. It might have been 8-10 hours of flight time to get into this
Wow.
location. And when it turns out we really didn't need I take that back. Once we needed the Russian translator because we had flown this whole way. And a little aside is that the language of aviation worldwide, no matter where you go, is English. So
Hmm.
very good for us U.S. citizens that don't
Yep.
speak many other languages. So very easy to transit through Russian airspace. It was only when we were talking with the destination tower that he began to talk back to us in Russian, and we're thinking, okay, bring up the guy, let him talk. And this guy, I'm assuming what he told him in Russian was, hey, these guys speak English. Please speak English to them. Because then the guy began to speak English to us. Anyway, anyway, we landed in this Novosibirsk, and I'm only assuming that maybe many Russian runways are just enormous based on Cold War usage. I don't know,
Sure.
but this runway was
Yeah, because you
probably.
you need a big runway to land the illusion, right?
Exactly. You're exactly right. And so we land and on this enormous runway, they taxi us off kind of into just this big concrete pad. And we also had a State Department guy with us, and he goes, "Oh, we're going to have to unload with a forklift," which is unusual for us Air Force. We usually have big loading trucks that have
Hmm.
scissors lifts that take lots of. Um, and there was a crowd, mostly men, that were kind of gathered around this forklift. And to cut the story a little bit shorter, we actually unloaded the airplane by hand with the
Oh wow.
help of all these. I think it was just like somebody said, "Hey, we got an airplane to unload.
Hey,
Follow me."
little did you know that you would be flying packages for the rest of your
Yeah,
career.
that's right. Exactly. So we get the airplane unloaded, and not everybody was busy doing everything, and so the us as the crew were out there standing. And the reason that this makes it, I mean, even more memorable than what I just described was we had no ability to speak. There was one guy that came up to me and he said, "Français?" I said, "No." He said, "Deutsch?" I said, "No, uh, only English." And he kind of shrugged his shoulders. But then we began to play charades on it, honestly. He was kind of pointed to the airplane, and we'd sort of try and have a conversation. And it was really cool because at this point I noticed it wasn't just men. There were some, not children, maybe teenagers there, and they would come up and they would point to the patches on my flight suit, like, "Hey, can I have that?" I didn't really want to, because if I gave it to one guy, 20 others, right? So, but what I did, speaking of coins, that's when we used to use coins back then. I had some change in my pocket, just
Oh boy.
nickels and dimes and quarters.
Okay.
And so I pulled, like, a nickel out, and I said, "Ruble," because I figured, well, I'll give him that, and he'd give me whatever is appropriate. And so now we had this little barter and trade, no language. And the moral of the story for me is me, like you, we were raised under this umbrella of the Cold War when we were children.
Hmm.
You know, duck and cover, all these things that we used to think that the Soviets were the big bad bear.
Right.
And now I'm deep into Russia, and I realize these people are just like us.
Hmm.
They're friendly. There's no animosity, and it was really fulfilling for me to know that, even in places that I would have never gone ever,
Sure.
to find those things, those adventures was really satisfying.
I'm really glad that you had that experience, which probably explains why you and I hit it off when we initially met. So I'm, I'm I'm thankful. I'm thankful for that.
Yeah, perhaps you were related to someone there.
You never know. It's a very, very small world. So
Exactly.
I have got a million and one other questions, but I want to wrap it up with the end since this is called the Built to Finish podcast. I love the story of your last flight before you retired, both in how you can explain this better than I can about flapping your wings to the tower, and then the role your wife played when you were approaching the gate. Can you share that?
I will. Yeah. It was a really special day, and that doesn't sneak up on you. You know when it's going to be your last
Sure.
day, last flight. And so I was able to choose my schedule, and it was just a little over 2 years ago now. And so I picked a trip. It was Chicago to Oakland, and I picked Oakland because born and raised here in the Bay Area, lots of family here, and I knew I was going to have the opportunity to have friends and family out at the airport to see my last flight. And so, um, and it was special because not only was my family there, some of my in-laws. There were a couple of guys that I had flown with a lot in at FedEx that helped arrange the arrival procedures and so forth. A bunch of mechanics that I knew that worked in Oakland, and some of the folks that were in the ramp office, which are kind of the coordinators on the ramp there. So we are approaching from Chicago, and the high altitude air traffic controllers are called center controllers. And so they were, advancing us, through the airspace, and then as you descend, you leave the center control space, and you get controlled by what they call approach controllers. And so I began to talk to those approach controllers, and the first guy I spoke to, you say, FedEx 1234, we're departing this altitude for this altitude. And the controller came back and said, "Roger that. We just want to give Captain Peters a congratulations for a career well flown." And I was really taken aback. I'm going, wow, somebody I know was able to get through the air traffic control system and tell these guys it was my last flight. And so you talked about three of those controllers. They all three of them, when we came on the radio, they gave me congratulations, which made me feel great. And then as we're arriving into Oakland, the final controller is the tower controller. And so we come in, and he says, FedEx 1234, when you land, if you could roll to the end of the runway. And that's an unusual command. Normally, as you know, when you land, you're usually turning off midfield or maybe a little bit further down to use the whole runway. And so as I'm getting ready to land, I look down at the end of the runway, and there are fire trucks down there, which is not usually a good sign. You don't want to see the fire trucks when you're arriving, but as it turned out,
And you had no idea that they had something special in mind for you. You just thought they were asking you something was up, causing them to ask you to go to the end of the runway.
I talked to this one ramp controller that I've known almost my entire career, that has worked in Oakland the entire. His first name's Jaime. Fantastic guy, just a lovable, friendly, ready to help guy. And I
Hmm.
mentioned to him mostly so he could kind of arrange for all my family to get through security, because that
Okay.
was obviously a thing. So he had done the phone calls. I found out later he had called the approach controller, so he notified the tower, he notified the fire department. And so as I cleared the runway, the fire trucks, those big giant green fire trucks,
Hmm.
there were four of them. They escorted me into parking. But the coolest thing, as you mentioned,
Wow.
is the one other thing that I did, because I'd taken the time um, to make these connections, especially with the mechanics, because the mechanics have so much to do with getting us good equipment,
Right.
and good meaning functional, ready to go on time, those sides. So I knew quite a few of these guys, and I asked the lead mechanic. I said, when my wife's there, could you let her be the one to marshal me into parking? And that's, you've seen it at the airport. They've got the wands. They're doing this, kind of motion to draw the airplane in. And then finally they cross the wands when you're at the parking spot. So this mechanic says, yes, absolutely. So that morning, they gave my wife the neon green hazard vest. They handed her the wands. They gave her a little bit of training. So as I turned in, not only was my family there, but there was my wife, who, to be honest, has never flown in an airplane that I've been the pilot of. So this was a great connection. It was about as close as we could to being doing the same job at the same time. And so there she was. We've got video of it, and it's really cool. My kids were there to watch. Lots of friends and family, and it was a really special ending, because when you stop and you set the parking brake, it didn't hit me right then. It took a while to realize
Yeah,
that
this
that
is
was
the
it.
third time during this conversation that I got chills again. You're just like continuously. So you stop that plane and the career is done. It's
Yeah,
like it's over.
that's right. It's not, there's not, granted, my friends and family were there, and it was a great celebration, but it's not like, this big fanfare or anything. It's like another flight. Park,
Right.
set the brake, and grab your stuff and get out.
Now, this is the part that I don't know if you want to share, but I just found it hysterical. So your wife is there with those devices,
Yeah,
signaling you in and telling you to stop. But she's obviously not certified to
yeah.
do this, and it's not legal for a civilian to bring in an aircraft. How did that work out?
So it is kind of funny, because obviously I told the mechanics. The mechanics had let my wife know what to do, where to stand, and so forth. And as we were taxiing in, my co-pilot, I was in the left seat, he's in the right seat, and he had his phone out, and he was videoing from the cockpit and there, of course, there are people in the plane getting the other perspective. But from the cockpit video, you can see my wife doing a very diligent job. But behind her is the mechanic doing exactly the same. So it wasn't until later maybe a day or two
And
later.
she didn't know that there was somebody behind her. She
No,
thought she was calling you. She was
she
doing.
thought she was, and to be honest with you, she was a little nervous, going,
I'm sure.
I sure hope Mark stops when he's supposed to stop.
He's gonna crash this thing into his
Yeah,
terminal
you
for his
know,
final
squish
hurrah.
squish all the family and friends, exactly. Yeah, but no, it was a really special day, and and that's the thing that uh, maybe is the ultimate moral of the story, is that had I not taken the time to make some of these connections with Jaime the Rampage and the lead mechanic and the guys I was flying with and my friends that helped my family through security, because none of that's required. But I
Sure.
think that sometimes that gets lost in our busy world, is to just take 5 minutes and figure out, that's not just the mechanic, that's George the mechanic.
Right.
And George lives in San Francisco and he's got 4 kids. And, it just, I think it helps, connect us, maybe make us a little bit more human.
That is such incredibly, that sage advice for everybody, and that goes across, every single profession, every single industry. If people would just take, more time out of their crazy busy day just to
Mhm.
build those tiny little relationships,
Yeah.
they just build up and they end up, being beneficial in the long run.
Yeah. No, it's the case. And it's universal. Doesn't matter if you're a pilot,
Exactly.
an entrepreneur, a mountain climber.
I do have one final question, and this is very selfish because I have a nephew that's pursuing a career in aviation, and probably listeners have other people that they know. What advice would you give someone considering a career in aviation, whether it be military or commercial?
You know, um, I'll have to say that I've had the opportunity to mentor a young man, and he was on the same swim team as our kids. He was younger than our kids, and from the time I knew him, honestly, maybe 10 or 12 years old, he wanted to be a pilot, and not only
Hmm.
just that, he wanted to be a FedEx pilot. And so he pursued that goal. Got good grades, and COVID kind of threw a wrench in the gears because he couldn't attend the aviation school that he wanted to. But that he didn't let that stop him. He found a way to get his certain certifications: private pilot, commercial pilot, airline transport pilot. He went to work in kind of very, for lack of a better term, minimum wage type jobs. He would instruct for money to help support his flying career. Um, but he had his goal set. He knew what he wanted to do in his life, and so props to him for that. But the thing is, the advice that I gave him, his name's Kyle, and the advice I gave Kyle was, so much of our success, not just in aviation, but in life, is luck and timing. And it
Right.
seems like, God, do we leave it up to luck and timing? And honestly, when you look back at successful careers, it has a lot to do with it. But what I also told Kyle is, you have to be ready, prepared when the luck arrives and when the timing arrives. And in my case, that's exactly what happened. Is, had I not been getting ready to get out of the Air Force, had I not made the friendships I had made with guys that had gone on to be at FedEx, and had FedEx not been hiring, and that was all about timing. Had my timing been different, and Delta and United and Southwest and other airlines, I might have ended up there and had a much different career than I enjoyed at FedEx. But again, so like I said, it's luck and timing with an asterisk, because I think that aviation is a long road, and there are going to be bumps in that road, and it's going to be tough. It's a I think back, I got my degree in engineering in college, and when I compared that experience to my pilot training experience, the pilot training experience honestly was way more difficult. And the reason I think that was is because it was in school, it's just you and the pencil, so to speak. There's really no performance tied to your success. Whereas when you're training to have a skill like becoming a pilot, you have to have both. You have to be smart and you have to be able to perform. So all those things kind of, when they intersect, that's what I'm talking about with the luck and timing. You have to be lucky and the timing has to be not perfect, but really good.
What a perfect way to end this episode. Thank you for being a guest here. You've shared some incredible stories. You've given some fantastic advice. And I didn't say this in the beginning, but you and I know each other because we go on an annual heli skiing trip every year.
Yes.
And we are going to see each other in a couple of days in Blue River, British Columbia. So maybe we can ask the pilot to, instead of letting us into the helicopter, he can he can just hoist us up and carry all 12 of us to the next
Well,
run.
yeah, just on the end of the line. Yeah, that'd be perfect.
That'll be a fun experience. Again, Mark, thank you so much. And thank you to all the listeners for tuning in and looking forward to speaking with you next time. That's a wrap for this episode of Built to Finish. Thank you for tuning in. For show notes and more details, head over to podcast.stephenpivnik.com. Special thank you to our sponsor, Acresis, offering tailored, high-impact advisory services to help founders get to their finish line with a strategic acquisition or majority investor recapitalization. Catch you next week.